There is a town in Arizona that climbs the side of a mountain so steeply that some of its buildings have 2 floors below the street before they ever touch solid ground. At its height, this town sat above one of the richest bodies of copper the world had ever found, and for a few glittering decades it was worth a fortune almost beyond counting. And then, the men who owned it made a single, fatal decision. They chose to take everything from beneath it. They carved more than 83 miles of tunnels into the hill the city stood on, and they packed those tunnels with dynamite and they lit it. And the ground, hollowed out and shaken loose, began to do the only thing left for it to do. It began to move. Slowly, building by building, the multi-million-dollar city of Jerome, Arizona, started to slide down its own mountain. This is the story of how a town dug out the earth beneath its own feet and then watched that earth carry it away. Before any of it, there was only the mountain. Cleopatra Hill rises on the flank of Mingus Mountain, looking out over the wide green sweep of the Verde Valley at an elevation of roughly 5,000 feet. The slope is severe, close to 30 degrees in places, the kind of grade that seems to refuse the very idea of a town. But inside that hill lay copper and silver and gold, laid down more than 1 billion years before any human being would think to want them. The peoples of the region had gathered the bright green and blue surface minerals here for centuries. Spanish explorers passed through in the 1580s and noted the ore, then moved on, because they were hunting for gold and silver and had no patience for stone, the color of a bruise. It was not until 1876 that 2 prospectors, Angus McKinnon and Morris Ruffner, filed the first American claims on the hill. They did not have the money to do much with them. Mining copper out of a mountain in the middle of the Arizona Territory with no railroad and no smelter within reach was a rich man's gamble. In 1883, a group of investors organized the United Verde Copper Company to take up that gamble. Among them was a New York financier named Eugene Jerome, who became the company's secretary and who, by most accounts, agreed to help fund the venture on one condition. The camp on the hill would carry his name. He would never once travel to see the town that bore it. History keeps a strange sense of humor in reserve for men like this. Eugene Jerome was a cousin of Jenny Jerome, the American woman who married into British aristocracy and gave birth to a son named Winston Churchill. And so, a rough copper camp clinging to an Arizona hillside was tied by a thread of blood and a vanity of naming to the man who would one day lead an empire through its darkest war. The first attempt at Jerome very nearly ended before it began. The cost of hauling ore out by wagon was ruinous, and then the price of copper fell by roughly half, and by the end of 1884, the company shut its doors. The camp emptied. It might have vanished entirely, become one of the countless names the West wrote in the dust, and then let the wind erase. But copper has a way of drawing wealthy men toward it, and one of the wealthiest in America was watching. His name was William Andrews Clark. He had already built one fortune out of the copper mines of Butte, Montana, and he had the cold patience of a man who buys what others are forced to sell. Around 1888, Clark acquired control of the Jerome property for a reported $80,000, a sum that would look, in the years to come, like one of the great bargains in the history of American mining. He enlarged the smelter. He built a narrow-gauge railway, the United Verde and Pacific, twisting 27 miles down through the hills to a junction below, a line so serpentine it was called the crookedest railroad in the world. And with the ore finally able to move, the money began to move with it. The town swelled. In 1890, perhaps 250 people lived on the hill. By 1900, there were more than 2,500, and the United Verde was the leading copper producer in the entire territory, employing around 800 men. Over the decades that the Clark family held the mine, it would pay out something like $102 million in dividends, of which the family owned 95%. Fortunes like that do not stay quiet. They build, they rise, and on a hillside too steep for a town, they built a town anyway. You have to understand what Jerome actually looked like to feel the strangeness of it. The streets did not lie flat. They stacked, one above another, cut into the grade of the mountain, so that a man standing on his own front porch might look directly down onto his neighbor's roof. Buildings reached down the slope with hidden lower floors, clinging to the hill by whatever engineering and nerve their builders could muster. It was a city built in defiance of gravity, and for a while, gravity seemed content to allow it. But wealth of that kind, arriving that fast, in a town of men far from home, does not produce a quiet place. Jerome became notorious. In 1899, a San Francisco newspaper called it the wickedest town in America. A few years later, in February of 1903, the New York Sun gave it the name that stuck, the wickedest town in the West. And the town seemed almost proud to earn it. At its peak, there were something like 21 saloons and 8 brothels working the slope, alongside gambling halls and opium dens, a whole economy of appetite running beneath the copper. The mine gave the men their wages, and the town, night after night, took the wages back. It was also a town built largely of wood, packed tightly onto a hillside, and towns like that tend to burn. Jerome burned again and again. There was a fire in 1894 that woke the town before dawn and took a dozen buildings. On Christmas Eve of 1897, a fire tore through a block of the red light district. In 1898 came a fire so severe that one account said it had blown Jerome off the face of the earth, and it cost several lives. Then, in May of 1899, a blaze that began in the Leland Hotel swept away hospitals and saloons and stores and homes. It was fire more than anything that finally pushed Jerome to incorporate as a town in 1899 so that it could tax itself, lay water mains, and rebuild in brick and stone. The town you can still walk through today, with its solid masonry storefronts, was born out of that decision to stop burning. But the fires in the end were survivable. What was coming for Jerome would not begin in the open air. It would begin underground. Because the wealth of Jerome was never really in the town. It was in the mountain beneath it. And to reach it, the companies had to go down and then keep going down. The trouble started with fire again, but this time a fire that could not be put out. The ore beneath Jerome was rich in sulfur, and sulfide ore, packed underground, can catch and smolder on its own. A serious underground fire took hold in the 1890s, and it burned in the workings for years, killing miners, collapsing tunnels, filling the shafts with smoke. You cannot easily fight a fire that lives inside a mountain. And so, rather than chase the ore through burning tunnels, the company made a choice that would reshape the very ground the town stood on. It would stop tunneling and start cutting the mountain away from above. It would dig an open pit. They called it the Big Hole. Beginning around 1918 and continuing for more than 20 years, the company gouged an open pit mine into the edge of the town, a wound in the earth eventually around 300 feet deep. And beneath and around it, the older network of tunnels kept spreading. Across the 70 years of underground work at the United Verde, miners cut more than 83 miles of passages into the hill, with shafts reaching down some 4,200 feet below the surface. To open the ore, they used blasting on a scale that made the buildings above shudder. The mountain that held Jerome up was slowly being turned into something closer to a honeycomb, an intricate emptiness dressed in the appearance of solid rock. And still the copper came. And still the fortunes grew. A second man arrived to take his own share of the hill. James Douglas, known by the blunt frontier nickname Rawhide Jimmy, acquired a claim called the Little Daisy in 1912 and developed a second great ore body, the United Verde Extension. When it struck enormously. In the single year of 1916, that mine produced something like $10 million in copper, silver, and gold, of which more than $7 million was pure profit. Douglas built a mansion on the hill to look down on the source of his wealth. Two mining empires now shared one mountain, and together they would take from it nearly 3 billion pounds of copper and treasure in gold and silver worth hundreds of millions more. By 1929, Jerome had reached its zenith. The district held as many as 15,000 people. There were automobile dealerships and swimming pools and ball fields. It was, by any measure the world used, a triumph. But a triumph built over emptiness is only borrowing against the ground, and the ground was about to ask for payment. If you are finding this story worth your time, consider subscribing, so the histories of these vanished American places keep finding their way to you. Now, let us return to the mountain, because by the 1920s, the mountain had begun to answer. The first signs were quiet, the way the worst things often are. Buildings in the heart of downtown began to crack. Walls pulled slightly out of true. Floors that had once been level developed a faint wrong tilt toward the valley. By 1928, at least 10 downtown buildings had been damaged past saving, and the cause was written plainly in the ground itself. A geological fault, the Verde Fault, runs directly beneath the town. Into that unstable seam, the companies had added everything else. The honeycomb of tunnels removing the rock's own support, the constant shock of blasting, shaking the slope loose, and the smoke from the smelters, which had killed off the vegetation across the surrounding hills and let the rains carve the bare earth away. Every choice made in the name of the copper had weakened the foundation of the town that the copper had built. The mountain gave its warnings first inside the mine, where the failures came, fast and violent. On the 30th of June 1929, a wide section in the center of the open pit suddenly dropped several feet. In March of 1931, more than 1 million tons of debris sheared off the northwest wall of the pit and slid, some pieces of rock as large as houses, bringing production to a halt. In March of 1936, hundreds of thousands of tons more failed on the southwest wall. Inside the great hole, the mountain was collapsing in slow, enormous convulsions. And what happened inside the pit was only the loudest version of what was happening, more gently and more relentlessly, beneath the town itself. This is the part of the story where legend and truth pull against each other, and the truth deserves to win, because the truth is strange enough. The story is often told as a single afternoon of terror, the whole city sliding down the mountain at once while wealthy residents fled in panic. That is not what happened. What happened was slower, and in its way, more haunting. Jerome did not fall. Jerome crept. Across the first half of the 20th century, building by building, the town inched downhill, the earth beneath it sinking and shifting away a few inches at a time. Some structures simply had to be abandoned as the ground failed under them. Others were lost outright. The post office, the jail, and other buildings were among those that the sinking earth took. There is a small, telling piece of Jerome lore that captures it perfectly. The town liked to say it had the first J.C. Penney store in Arizona, and also the second J.C. Penney store in Arizona. Because the first one had slid down the hill, nothing embodies this slow surrender like the building the town came to call the sliding jail. It was built in 1905, a block of poured concrete cells meant to be the most immovable structure a rough mining town could imagine. Then, The blasting reshaped the hill beneath it, and around 1938, the jail began, very slowly, to travel. It did not tumble. It slid, foot by foot, down the slope, tearing away from the building it had been attached to. Over the years, it moved roughly 225 feet from where it was built. The town, rather than fight it, simply rerouted the road around it and let it go. You can still visit that jail today, resting far below where its builders set it, a concrete monument to the single mistake at the heart of this story. They had believed you could take everything from beneath a town and expect the town to keep standing. The jail is the proof that you cannot. And yet, for all of that, the shifting ground is not what killed Jerome. This is the hard truth beneath the dramatic one. The subsidence damaged the town, frightened it, and scarred it. But towns can rebuild on scarred ground, as Jerome had already rebuilt after the fires. What a town cannot survive is the disappearance of the reason it exists. And Jerome existed for one reason only: copper. In 1929, copper sold for around 24 cents a pound, and the mines ran near capacity, and the town thrived. Then, the Great Depression fell across the country, and the price of copper fell with it. By 1930, copper had dropped to roughly 14 cents. By 1932, it had collapsed to around 5 cents a pound. At that price, the richest mine on earth cannot pay its miners. The layoffs came, the shutdowns came. The United Verde extension, that second great fortune, operated at a loss and finally ceased work in 1938. In 1935, William Andrews Clark's heirs sold the original United Verde properties to the mining giant Phelps Dodge for a reported $21 million. The empire was changing hands, and the hands it was changing into were doing the arithmetic of an ending. The Second World War bought the town a little time, as the demand for copper surged and the mines ran once more. But the richest ore was already gone, and what remained lay deeper and cost more to reach with every passing year. When the war ended, the arithmetic returned, colder than before. The smelter down in Clarkdale shut its fires around 1950 and 1951. And then, in 1953, Phelps Dodge closed the mines of Jerome for good. The wages stopped. And when the wages stop in a town that has no other reason to exist, the people do not linger. They leave. They left so quickly and with so little hope of selling anything that many simply walked away from furnished homes, closing the door on the lives they had lived there. The population of Jerome, which had once been counted in the many thousands, fell and kept falling until only about 50 people remained on the whole of the hill. And then Phelps Dodge, which owned much of the town, began tearing the empty buildings down for their salvage value, pulling apart the very city its copper had raised. The great vertical boomtown of Arizona, the wickedest town in the West, the multi-million-dollar city on Cleopatra Hill, had become a near-empty ruin, half sliding into the valley, half carted off for scrap. It should, by every ordinary law of these stories, have died there. It did not, and that is the last turn in the tale. A handful of the people who stayed refused to let Jerome vanish. In 1953, the year the mines closed, they founded the Jerome Historical Society, opened a small mine museum, and did something almost defiant. They began to sell the town's own death as its future. They marketed Jerome as the largest ghost city in America. And when Phelps Dodge moved to demolish the main town site, it was these residents who, in 1956, negotiated to stop the wrecking. They saved the bones of the town by insisting that the ruin itself was worth keeping. Slowly, the strangeness that had nearly killed Jerome became the very thing that drew people back to it. A city stacked impossibly on a mountainside. Half of it slid loose from its foundations, steeped in stories of fire and vice and buildings that walked downhill. Artists came for the cheap buildings and the dramatic light. Then more artists came. Studios and galleries opened in the old brick storefronts. On the 13th of November 1966, Jerome was designated a National Historic Landmark, its ruin now recognized as something the nation should protect. Today, roughly 450 people live in Jerome, in a town that survives on the memory of its own near destruction, welcoming visitors who come to walk streets that once tried to slide out from under the people who built them. Stand on that hillside now and the whole of it is there at once. The green valley below, the terraced streets, the open scar of the pit, and somewhere down the slope, a concrete jail sitting far from where anyone meant it to be. Jerome began as a mountain full of copper, and men who could not stop themselves from taking every last ounce of it, even the ounces holding their own town up. That was the mistake. Not a single afternoon of catastrophe, but a decision, made and remade for decades, that the ground would always forgive what was taken from it. The ground did not forgive. It moved. And the strangest mercy in all of it is that the town, hollowed out and half fallen, refused in the end to die. It stands there still, leaning on the mountain that it emptied, a monument to the appetite that built it, and to the same appetite that nearly took it away. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and let the next lost American city find its way to you the same way this one did.